I'm a Blender artist, and I've been on a mission to remake everything I can get my hands on in 3D. First I started with desktop icons, then I did video game icons, but I'm not stopping there. Now I'm doing apps. Starting with the one I spend way too much time on, TikTok. Like most of these, I started by making the simple background, and that's just a plane that I beveled the corners of using Ctrl-Shift-B to bevel the verts, and then I extruded it and added a little bit of bevel to the edges to give it a sort of nice rounded edge. Then I moved on to the icon itself. And to do that, I used a modeling technique that I use all the time, which is adding a single vert and extruding it into a chain of verts that makes the outline of the object that I'm trying to make. Then I add a subdivision modifier, and I work from there. Sub-D modeling, in my view, is much easier for approaching even simple or complex shapes that have lots of curves especially, just because you can get a smoother curve and you don't have to do as much work fiddling with that curve to make sure everything matches perfectly. With my subdivision modifier on there, I just moved the individual verts around until the outline of the subdivided mesh lined up perfectly with my reference. Then I used offset edges extrude to extrude that edge evenly into a flat plane the shape of the main part of the icon. And offset edges extrude is super helpful. I use this function all the time, and it's part of the Edit Mesh Tools extension, which can be found for free on the extensions platform. Then I just extruded this edge out and added a few divisions to shape it into the tail of the T. With that done, I extruded the entire shape out, selected the outer edges, and used Shift-E to crease them to sharpen the edges where I wanted it to be sharp. Then I just duplicated the entire thing and repositioned it to make the second one. For the icon material, I just made a simple blend of a transparent material and a colored emission shader, one for the red and one for the blue. And then I set up the blending so that the area in between the two would be a mixture of the two colors. And I followed that up by adding a glare node in my compositing setup just so I could get a nice little glow around the icon, because I think that looks pretty cool and it's a nice addition to the original. Now, while you watch me work on that, let's talk about the animation. I wanted to think of what would be a cool type of animation to do for this icon when you launch the app. And I wanted that animation to be true to what the app is about. And what's TikTok known for? Well, the thing that I suffer from with it, which is being stuck on it, infinite scrolling for way too long. And I had this idea that the icon should scroll upwards maybe 2 or 3 times, possibly 4, and each time the icon that scrolls onto the page should be doing something that you would see someone doing on TikTok. And the first one I decided I wanted to be a dance, because of course, that's what the app was known for originally. So with that in mind, I went ahead and started building a simple bone-based rig for the icon. And the reason I am just extruding a ton of bones rather than putting in areas for controllers and stuff is I'm going to be using an add-on called Bone Dynamics. And Bone Dynamics is really cool. It lets you basically add some basic wiggle physics to your bones. So you can grab your armature and shake it around and the bones will jiggle accordingly. Oh man, that's not right. It's supposed to dance, not melt. After doing a little poking around, I realized that this was entirely my fault for the way I'd set the rig up, so I deleted it and started over. This time, I decided to have all the bones run the same direction because the issue that I had was mostly created by the bones basically going opposite directions with a inflection point between the 2 different directions in the bottom of the curve. And Bone Dynamics really didn't like that, and probably should have known that going in, but hey. The theme of the channel is never stop learning, so it would be silly if I didn't learn something every time I make one of these videos, right? With my rig remade correctly this time, I might add, I went ahead and added dynamics to all the bones just by putting it into pose mode, selecting all the bones, and clicking Add Dynamics. Then I duplicated the collection that contained both the dynamics and the rig itself 4 times so that I had 4 different icons. And I parented the armatures of each of those to a single empty at the top so that I can scroll that empty by animating it, and all of the icons will follow. That way I don't have to animate each of the armatures scrolling separately, and instead I can focus on giving them each a unique personality. With the scroll animation in, I decided to start animating the dance, and to do that I just used the record function and jiggled it around a bit to create the illusion of it dancing. I like recording keyframes when it's something organic like this because it lets me animate really quickly without too much work. And I'll come back to the dance later to add some lights and do some more stuff to sell that it's a dance, but the next one I wanted to move on to was DIY TikTok. And I've been spending a lot of time on DIY TikTok because I've been renovating a house, and let me tell you, it is not easy, and there's all sorts of stuff that I've had to learn along the way, and it's been pretty helpful for that. So my idea for this one was to have the icon using a nail gun to nail some studs into a wall. And initially I was like, great, I'll just grab a nail gun model and I'll animate it in and it'll be perfect. But when I went looking around, there wasn't a nail gun model that I really liked, at least not for a price that I was happy with. But that's the great thing about being a 3D artist. If I can't find something, I can just make it. So for the nail gun model, I basically just made it out of primitives. And this is the modeling approach I take with 99% of hard surface stuff, especially. Hard surface is modeling terms for objects like vehicles and props, things that are non-living. Character modeling could be a little trickier, and there are some different approaches to that, but I do mostly hard surface work anyway, so this is certainly the workflow I'm most used to. For the main body of the nail gun, I'm taking a subdivision approach, so I quartered this, so I only had to model a quarter of it, and then I just added a mirror modifier to make up the other quarters, and a subdivision modifier to smooth the mesh. And then I'm just adding loops where necessary to control my edges and make those nice hard shapes while still getting a high detail and nicely smoothed and rounded in the places where I want it to be final result. And then for the rest of it, I'm just going to model with simple primitives and shape them into the shapes that I want, and then add a bevel modifier to them just to add that little extra bit of detail that you'll see while rendering that really sells the realism. Now, this is not an actual model of nail gun, but it's still important to add details like these spikes that I'm putting on the nail barrel, because if you think about the way various devices work, even if this is not a specific brand of nail gun, most nail guns work in the same way. And like one of the key features of a nail gun is they often have these spikes on the area where the nails come out so that you can brace them against the wood you're shooting the nail into and they don't slip off. And it's important to include details like that, whether your reference is real or fictional, because those details are part of what add realism, and they are included in basically every model of whatever it is that you're working on because they're functional. And you can apply that to vehicles as well. You know, airplanes, cars, whatever, they all have some core features that, while they might be styled differently depending on the brand, they all need in order to function. And part of becoming a good 3D artist is to start to recognize those details and be able to pick them out from the other stuff and identify what helps make, you know, a specific vehicle look like that specific vehicle. And one of the ways to do that is just look at a ton of references. The guy I initially trained under when I was studying 3D in college said you can tell the quality of an artist by the size of their reference folder. That was a long time ago, but I think that's still very true. And I want to keep pointing this out, which is that if you're watching me work, you'll see that while I'm doing a lot of modeling here, none of this is like super groundbreaking or even all that complicated stuff. Really, a lot of what building a complex model is figuring out how to break it down into the simplest primitive shapes and making those and putting them together. Most models are just a combination of cylinders, cubes, and spheres. One of the things that will happen when you're modeling, especially if you're doing something that is a lot of simple primitives like this, is you'll get in the flow of things and then you'll run across something that's a little bit more complicated than just shaping simple primitives, and you'll be tempted to do it the fast way, which leads to a topology mess, which is exactly what I did with the little anchor that holds the bracket that holds the nail holster on. And I did that by just shaping it and beveling the corner verts, which creates an interesting shape that you'll see me having to deal with in a little bit. To untangle this mess, I basically had to delete all the face topology that was created by my corner cutting, literally, and instead match the number of divisions by just putting in some loop cuts into these edges and just filling the faces around them to basically create quad topology. Nothing super complicated, but one of those things where you do it occasionally and you realize that it would have just been faster and more satisfying to do it the right way in the first place. At least I can duplicate this face and use bridge to make all of the edges. At least I don't have to model that whole separate set of faces. Which gets at another point I wanted to bring up, actually. One of the things that you should be focusing on is getting faster. You should know how to make good topology, but there are, a handful of examples of how to solve topology problems, and eventually you learn those probably relatively quickly for the most part. But one of the things that you take a while to learn, at least in my experience, is the fastest way to do things. And it's important to get into the idea of repeating stuff as much as possible. The more instances of stuff you can use, the more repeat geometry you can use, the less time you end up spending on stuff. And this is a perfect example of that, these screws. Rather than making this screw 40 times, or even making it once and duplicating the geometry, I instead made it a single time, put it in a collection, and created collection instances of it everywhere I need one. That way, if I make changes to the original, all of those changes carry through to the collection instances, and I can realize those instances as needed if I want to make them into actual geometry. Now, it's totally your preference with this if you want to do that via linked duplicates or collection instances. Collection instances, in my experience, are ever so slightly more lightweight, although linked duplicates are still instances, and so they are still much faster than true duplicates. But I tend to use collection instances for tons of stuff because it lets me basically build a set of parts with the parent parts in a collection or even in a separate scene if it's too complicated, and then I can pull from that sort of parts bin as needed, and it's just an easier mental model for me to sort of organize the stuff that I'm working with. But again, linked duplicates versus collection instances is sort of more of a preference thing than it is a performance thing. And lastly, I just finished this off by adding in my screws, adding some little vents, and just taking a quick pass to add detail where I could. And then I moved on to materials. The materials I pulled from my CC0 material library that I've accumulated from a bunch of different sources, and I just lightly modified the plastic materials to make them the different colors that I wanted, and added them to the various parts of the nail gun that made sense. And I went with a sort of DeWalt-like color scheme because I'm a DeWalt guy myself, although I also have a bunch of Milwaukee tools, which are quite nice. I was actually just this weekend listening to a podcast called Guys. It's a podcast that basically looks at various different subcultures. It's pretty new. And they just did an episode on tool guys, and I was shocked to discover how strong people's opinions are on tool brands. So I'm curious, what's your favorite tool brand? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, with a bit more work, I got the colors of the materials set up how I wanted them, and did a little bit of fiddling with where I wanted each of the materials placed, and then I had a nail gun that I was happy with. And the great thing about that is now it's my own asset, and I can use it for whatever I want. Which is a perfect segue for me to make a little announcement. I am opening YouTube memberships and a Patreon. The perks will be the same for both, so don't subscribe to both unless you really want to support me for some reason, but it's basically giving you a choice between which platform you prefer. And if you help support the channel through either of those, you get some perks, which includes me releasing all of the model files for the various icons that I've done, as well as a bunch of the other videos, and some of the assets that I've created in that process, including this nail gun, as well as a ton of behind-the-scenes footage, including the unedited footage of most of these projects. I'll have a link for the Patreon in the description as well as here on the screen, and of course YouTube memberships aren't just handled through the YouTube memberships interface. Remember, only get one unless you really want to support me, but the benefits for both are the same, so you only need one. Anyway, shameless plug over. So I started working on this DIY scene, and I wanted to basically have some partially framed walls with no drywall, since I've been seeing a lot of that lately while working on my house. And to do that, I just added a plane, created some cuts in it, beveled them, and extruded them. And I ended up thinning these out because I initially put way too many cuts and it just looked too dense. Wall studs are only about 16 inches apart generally, and I had mine way too close. I also created a collection instance of the nail gun that we made, and I used a parent constraint to attach that to the hand bone, the bone at the very tip of the T in the icon for this one, which will just allow it to move with the icon and look natural, like it's almost being held by the icon. Then with my walls made, I duplicated them to add a second one so that I can have something for my guy to nail into, and I added a simple nailing animation to the armature where it moves in and out to nail into the wall, and it also moves down slightly as if it's doing a nail line. Being the ever ADHD person that I am, I couldn't sit still long enough to finish that one, so I moved back to my dance animation. And I wanted to create some lights that change color, and to do that, I just added a couple lights, and I added a keyframe to the color property, and then I went into the F-curve modifiers and added noise modifiers to each of the different colors. That way, the randomized noise controls the colors, and it basically generates random and different colors. And that way I could just duplicate the light and offset them a little bit, and I have these kind of cool disco light setups. Then I went back to working on the DIY animation, and I basically just added in some simple area lights to light up the room that I've made, and started adding some materials from my material library. I also wanted to take a moment to note that the reason that you can't see the room outside of where the app is is because that mesh that I created, and you could kind of see in an earlier part of the video, is in a different collection, and I'm using that as a holdout layer to basically block everything around the outside of where the app icon is. Holdout layers and collections are super useful if you want to create a lot of complicated mesh-based masks really quickly, and it's great for layer blending and basically cheating what you want to be visible. With my materials on, I decided to make a simple air hose, and I did that by just extruding a circle and then using this neat poke faces trick, which I've added in my YouTube shorts and TikToks, to basically make some knurling, which is that grippy stuff that you see often on air hose connectors and other various kinds of connectors that make it easier to grab. And for the hose itself, I just used a curve, and I used a hook function to hook that curve to an empty so that when I move the nail gun around, the curve moves with it. And to add the thickness to the hose, I just went into the geometry settings for it and added some bevel depth. And then I added a very simple yellow rubber material to match the rest of the nail gun, and it was time to move to render. And with it rendered out, here's the final result. And that's it for this one. So if you want to see something specific, jump into Discord and let me know what that is. And if not, make sure you ring the bell so you don't miss the next video. And that's my reminder to tell you to never stop learning.